Now I see 'twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my tears revealed. How precious deep that grace appeared. They are I just believe. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we'll last days to sing God's praise. And when we first begun. Great. Wonderful. Now number 13, and we'll have Joe's music. Joe, can you hear?
13 is which one?
It is,
Okay, so you have it right there. Okay.
okay, ready?
Are we ready?
Okay,
Go. Go ahead.
Yeah. Lord, I love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you read my mind. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way from the earth to the cross. My debt to make from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I love to sing your praises. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way from the earth to the cross. My debt to make from the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Okay, and number 18.
Open the eyes of my
Lord, open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you.
Well, why don't we begin our study? Everyone have an outline? All right. Now, is it started on?
Yes, I'm recording.
Okay. We are starting tonight the book of Joshua. Joshua has 24 chapters, and if I can get through 2 chapters a week. I'm sorry. In 2 weeks, 1 chapter. I'm sorry. If I can get through in 2 weeks, 1 chapter, which will be a challenge enough, it's going to take us a year. Okay? That's 48 weeks. So I'm trying to really accomplish, because otherwise, we may, end up in the rapture, still studying Joshua. So now, look at the beginning of your outline. So I want to talk about, first of all, why study this book. What's the significance, the importance of the book of Joshua? First of all, it's an important historical book. It has an important historical context that connects the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, with the next books of the Bible, which are called the historical books. So it's the bridge in between the teaching of the Torah, the promises of the Torah, the stories of the Torah, the history of the Torah, and how that is fulfilled and it moves on in the future. So it's very important from that standpoint. It's also important because it has interesting archaeological evidence in it. And we'll look at some of that archaeological evidence. The walls of Jericho have been excavated. Many of these cities that Joshua talks about, the city of Ai, many other places that are famous places have been excavated. We know more or less what they're like. We know that indeed the walls of Jericho did indeed fall down. Okay, we know that they were big. We know that they were thick. We have that evidence archaeologically. So we'll look a little bit at the archaeology too, because it demonstrates the accuracy and proves what is said in the text. Also, we find that the book of Joshua documents and fulfills the prophecy and promises of Israel's claim to the land. And that's a very, very important point. Turn, if you would, to Genesis chapter 15. Genesis chapter 15. And we're going to start in verse 16. Let me read. Then in the 4th generation, they shall return here. Where? From where?
From all over.
No, not from all over. Where are they? That they,
Genesis 15, 16?
starting in verse 16.
15, 16. Where are they?
Where are they going to return from? Where have they been?
From Egypt?
That's from Egypt. They were 400 years in Egypt. That's 430 years, exactly. So it says, then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. The Amorite is a general statement of the peoples that it occupied, the pagan peoples that occupied the land of Israel during that 400 years. Okay? In other words, when it's time, when their sin has come to its point of running over, then God will enact his judgment on those peoples through them coming, the Jews coming back into the land. Verse 17, and it came about when the sun had set, that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven, and had a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. I'm not going to describe that because it's not really that important in terms of what we're talking about here. But there's this agreement, this promise that God's making to Abraham, okay? Verse 18, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, that is the River Euphrates. So there's the southern border. Euphrates is the north and northeastern border. He says then the Canaanite, the Kenizzite, the Cadmonite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, and the Raphaim. We had to throw in there one of the giant tribes, the Raphaim, okay, all right, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. So he speaks of all these different peoples from different areas around the territory of what is Israel. Now, what I find is interesting, among many things about this, is we've now had how many years of the United Nations disputing the territory of Israel. I don't care what they say about the territory of Israel. Okay? I know what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen.
Sure do.
God has promised it. They're going to retain it. They're never going to leave it. And the fulfillment of what we looked at last month in Zechariah is going to occur there. All right? It's going to happen, despite what any political entity or terrorist group says. So it's important to realize that from the time that this is given, and then eventually when the people go down into Egypt, Jacob and his family go down there, the 70 of them, and they spend those years down there, part of which they spend in slavery. When the time comes, they're going to take the land. This is the book of Joshua. The time has come. The 430 years is at its end. It's time for them to go into the land. And that's, again, extremely significant. Now, another element of Joshua that I really love is it's filled with timeless teaching about spiritual life principles that are applicable to all believers. You're going to see as we go into this book. It has wonderful things to teach us spiritually about our lives that apply to everyone who's ever read it, of any generation, of any age, of any time. It's filled with wonderful teaching. It's almost in a sense the epistles of the Old Testament. It has that level of wonderful teaching to it about spiritual growth and maturity and things like this. Faith, character. Also, of course, we cannot miss the fact that this book is named Yeshua. Okay? Yeshua. Jesus.
Right.
Joshua. Okay, Jesus is the Greek name. Yeshua, of course, Messiah's name in Hebrew. And of course, this book and the person of Joshua shows us about Messiah's character, his work, and we're going to see also, it's going to show us things about his ministry, too. Now, I picked out a quote here that actually comes from Chuck Missler, and I think it's an excellent quote in F. Prophecy authenticates the message by predictions which occur after they are foretold. In other words, one of the great things about prophecy is God says this is going to happen, and it's going to happen in this way, and then when it occurs, it authenticates the message. You now know that the message is accurate. All right?
What is the authentication?
It proves it. It demonstrates it. It certifies it as being accurate. And it's interesting that we're going to find some very interesting prophetic elements to the book of Joshua. Now, Joshua is not, in and of itself, a prophetic book. It's an historical book. But I want you to pay attention as we go through it about the repetition of certain numbers, the repetition of certain patterns, the repetition of certain images, because I'm going to show you, or I think you're going to see, that they show up later. And since we studied Zechariah, and since we studied Revelation, you should be in a good position to see them. You're going to see them in their images here, right in this book also. So it's also, in that sense, a very interesting book. Now let's start out in this book by looking at, I think, what's the most important thing to pay attention to. And that is, since this book is about the person of Joshua, let's look at what we know about the person of Joshua. So we're going to go through these Old Testament passages that involve this man, Joshua. We're going to start in Exodus chapter 17. So go there, and we're going to start in verse 8. Exodus 17, starting at 8. They have just come out of Egypt. They have crossed through the Red Sea. They have gathered at this camp area, okay? And one of the first things that happens to them is they find themselves in a battle. And the person and the people, the person that attacks them, the king, is Amalek. And of course, his people are called the Amalekites. So starting verse 8, then Amalek came and fought against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose men for us and go out and fight against Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. Now, what's the first thing that you conclude when you read verse 9? What do you conclude about Joshua?
He's a military leader.
He's a military leader right from the beginning. He's trained in he's the general. And so Moses says to him, General Joshua, rally the troops. We got a battle here. The second thing that's interesting is you're going to find that this is a very weird battle.
Yeah.
There's a lot of battles in the book of Joshua that are weird battles. The weirdest probably of all being the battle at Jericho. Because when we go through it, you're going to realize that it breaks all the rules of the Old Testament in the battle. It's very odd, okay? But it's for a reason.
Okay, say it again.
Which part do you want to say again? Okay. That when you look even as an example of the Battle of Jericho, it is a very bizarre battle. It's performed in a very bizarre way, and it's done in a way, for instance, the last part of the battle, on the seventh day, they march around the city 7 times. What are you supposed to do on Shabbat if you're a good Jew? You're supposed to march 7 times around a big city?
You're not even supposed to mark.
Exactly. So it has some very interesting elements to it. This also is a very odd battle. Let's show you. One of the keys to understanding this battle is, what's the focus here? He tells them, he says, tomorrow I, Moses, will station myself on the top of the hill that overlooks this area with the staff of God. So the emphasis here is the staff. What staff is that? What did that staff do?
Part of the Red Sea.
Part of the Red Sea was used to do so. So he's taking that staff, and it's going to be in his hand as he goes on top of this hill when this battle occurs. So verse 10.
It also brought water from the rock.
Right. It did too also. And Joshua did as Moses told him and fought against Amalek, and Moses and Aaron and Hur went on up to the top of the hill. Now here's the thing that's very interesting. So it came about when Moses held his hand up that Israel prevailed, and when he let his hand down, Amalek prevailed. You go, why's that? Okay? Think about it. And then why? Why couldn't God just taken Moses' staff and zapped them and that's it?
Because it shows the dependence on God's
Power. But it also showed that they had to do something
Right.
in the process of God demonstrating his power. And you're going to see that principle all the way through the book of Joshua. Okay? Now, verse 11. So it came about when Moses held his hand. Well, we just read that. Verse 12. But Moses' hands were heavy. Then they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, and Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side, one on the other side. Thus the hands were steady until the sun set. So Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. Notice these next couple verses and ask yourself, why? Then the Lord said to Moses, write this in a book as a memorial and recite it to Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. So if you have any question about how we know this history is accurate, you're going to see reference after reference, God telling Moses and then finally telling Joshua, write it in the book, write it in a book, write it in a book. Okay? Over and over again.
This is the first time it's been said, the first command about
It is.
Write it down.
It is. Write it down. Okay? This is the beginning of the Torah we're looking at right here. And then he says, of course, and recite it to Joshua. Why?
To remember what God has done.
Yes. And because everything that we're going to read here, in all these verses, we're going to go...
Joshua was supposed to be his successor.
Exactly. These are all the elements of the preparation of Joshua. Okay, so the book becomes a prominent element in Joshua's life. And then he says, and Moses built an altar and named it, the Lord is my banner. And then verse 16, which is an absolutely horrible translation in the English. Okay? And he said, the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, if you look at this verse in the Hebrew, for whatever reason, I have no idea why, they leave out a whole phrase and they don't translate it. The words are there in the Hebrew. I looked it up. I don't understand why they leave it out. But let me put the words in.
Which word? He's ready to tell us.
I'm sorry.
You're going to tell us.
Yeah, the word that it leaves out is the word kisah. The word kisah. For whatever reason, translators don't translate it.
Where are you now?
I'm in verse 16.
Chapter?
Same, right where we are, verse 16. Chapter 17, verse 16. So let me read it in the English, translating the word. Okay? It reads, for the hand of Amalek is against the throne of the Lord. That's what the word kisah means. It means the throne of God. So the hand of Amalek is against the throne of the Lord. Now, think about that for a minute. Why is that said? For the hand of Amalek is against the throne of the Lord, and then it goes on and says, and the Lord will have war against Amalek from generation. Why is he saying that the Lord will have war with him generation after generation? I mean, it isn't like they have like 25 battles with Amalek. So why does he say that?
He's having to deal with Satan.
There you go. Jan's got it. Remember, go back to Genesis 3:15. There's a promise there. It's about Satan's seed and God's seed, right? Remember the promise. Very, very famous is the first promise of Messiah. The Messiah will come from the seed of a woman. Now, there's a strategy that goes on. Satan has his seed. Satan has his descendants. Satan has his followers. So where does he plant them?
In the eye.
Where?
In the eye.
Yeah, right.
They were told to kill all these eyes,
Yes.
and they didn't do it because they're having to suffer.
He plants them right in the land that God had already promised that the Jews are going to get. Right? He plants them right there. And that's why we see that what is going to go on in the book of Joshua is not just military. Okay? There's going to be a spiritual battle that goes on that's reflected in the military battles that go on. Because it's the battle over the land. It's the battle between God's strategy and Satan's strategy. Keep that always in mind when we look at these, because it'll explain a lot of the reasons why God tells Joshua to do the things he does. Because sometimes you go, why did he do that? If you think of this and keep it as the big picture, you're going to understand better why. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I don't understand the last part of 14. Does that mean literally he's going to give him amnesia kind of, or is that metaphoric?
It means that that Amalek and his memory and his reputation and his abilities and his past battles and victories are going to be laid low. Okay? He's going to be a victim of God's efforts, and those efforts are going to be caused by God using the rod of Moses, okay, in the process. God, rod of Aaron, but God also rod of Moses in the process.
So he's talking about blotting out the memory when all is said and done.
Yes, when all is said and
I thought
done.
it meant like
Right.
now.
In other words,
because you're not-
you think you occupy this land, you're going to be dispossessed, and you're not going to be particularly remembered, but Israel will. Okay? All right. Now, let's go to the next verse about Joshua. Go from Exodus 17 to Exodus 23. Let's learn something else about him. Exodus 23, starting at verse 20. Now this is again, another very interesting verse that you have to really think why. You there? 23:20. Behold, I'm going to send you an angel before you to guard you along the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Be on your guard before him and obey his voice. Do not be rebellious towards him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, since my name is in him. But if you will truly obey his voice and do all that I say, notice, obey his voice and do all that I say, therefore the angel must be related to the Lord. Right, okay? I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries, for my angel will go before you and bring you to the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and I will completely destroy them. So, there's going to be a spiritual leader of these people. And we see him actually in, I think it's the 5th chapter of Joshua. He shows up. No.
The literal angels.
The captain of the Lord's
The
host.
Captain of the Lord's host. It's the night before the battle, quote, to take Jericho. And Joshua goes and takes a little walk the night before. Okay, he's the commander, the general. Maybe he's kind of nervous about how the troops going to perform and so and so. Okay, so he's walking, and all of a sudden, he meets this guy. All right, and when he meets him, he immediately falls down before him. Okay, remember, you don't fall down and worship an angel. It's forbidden. Okay, so he meets Messiah.
Right, because it doesn't tell him to get up.
Right. And then he says, and Messiah then gives Joshua the battle plan for Jericho that night. All right? Here's the angel of the Lord. This is who's being talked about. But there's another interesting thing here, because I think we need to look at the law of double meanings on this one. So I want you to turn to Numbers 13. From Exodus to Leviticus to Numbers 13. It's interesting how you read these verses and all of a sudden there's this one verse, information is given to you, and you go, wow, that must be kind of important. So verse 16 is one of these, of Numbers 13. These are the names of the men whom Moses sent to spy out the land. So these are all the men. He names who they are. These 12 guys that go out, remember, when they were spying out the land.
Sweetheart, it's verse 17, not 16.
Well, not my Bible.
Really?
It's verse 16. Okay. All right, so let me continue. He says, but Moses called Hoshua, the son of Nun, Joshua. He named him from Hoshua to Yeshua. The word Hoshua in Hebrew means God, it means salvation. Yeshua, which he names him, means God is my salvation, or the God of salvation. The Greek version, of course, is Jesus. So Joshua is renamed by Moses in the English or Greek equivalent, Jesus. All right? And I think this verse has a double meaning, because who's the leader? Who's the physical, quote, angel? You know, angel can be, an angel, angelos, in the Greek, can be either a angel or it can be a human messenger. It can be used either way. And again, I think it's a double meaning. Joshua is going to be the physical leader or angel or messenger that's going to lead them, just like Messiah is going to be the spiritual one. Okay? Physical one, spiritual one. All right? Same principle here. Now, let's go on to, and again, I think this shows us that Joshua, time and time again, is shown to be a type of Christ. One of the things you notice about Joshua is there's nothing bad ever said about him. Now, my wife has maybe a semi-dispute about that, about one incident.
Well,
but
I'll agree with that,
yeah.
but...
At any rate, he is not criticized. He is not spoken of about his sin. He just does an amazing job of following the Lord to the very end of his life. Okay? Obedient, like Jesus was obedient to his Father. So now go to Exodus, one chapter over to Exodus 24. I'm sorry, we were in 23. Go back to Exodus. Sorry, go back to Exodus and go to chapter 24. Exodus 24. And we're going to start in verse 9. Here's another element of Joshua's training. Okay, then Moses went up. They're talking about going up to Mount Sinai. All right, the people are camped around it, and a bunch of people are going to go up onto the mountain. Moses went up with Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and 70 of the elders of Israel. So this group goes part way up the mountain. And they had an unbelievable experience. Verse 10. And they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. It reminds you of some other experiences that people have had. What are some of those others? Does the book of Isaiah come to your mind? What does Isaiah in chapter 6 find? He sees the throne of the Lord right there, but he's shown the throne room. How about some others? Can you think of other experiences? How about the very end of the Bible? Paul possibly being in the third heaven, taken up to third heaven. John, also in Revelation 4:3, it talks about the throne room of God. It talks about the clear kind of pavement of the throne room of God. So we see a very similar thing. So let's go on. It says, it says, under their feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire as clear as the sky itself. Yet the Lord, he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel. In other words, he didn't, even though he allowed them to see them in their imperfect, sinful form, he didn't act against the evil in them and all. And he says, and they beheld God, and they ate and drank. Does that strike you as being unusual? You end up being shown the throne of God, and in the process, God decides to provide you a meal. It's interesting, isn't it? But think about it.
Supper of the Lamb.
In Genesis 18, God and two angels, the Lord and two angels, show up at Abraham's tent, Sarah there, and what happens? They're fed, and they eat with Abraham and Sarah. You go on. Jesus has the Last Supper with his disciples. Jesus dies and resurrects. He comes back, and what does he do then? He goes and fixes fish and eats with them. And as Ann just said, then, of course, we see that all the believers, when the church is gathered and put in all of us our new bodies, we meet at the marriage supper of the Lamb. So somehow, God, eating is an integral part of fellowship, even his fellowship with man. Isn't it interesting? Something as common as consumption of food.
I love to eat.
Yeah, well, and now you have a spiritual justification for it. Isn't that great, okay? I think it's very interesting. So, this group goes up there. Let's go on. And he says, now the Lord said to Moses, verse 12, come up to me on the mountain and remain there. In other words, come up higher is the indication in the Hebrew. Come up a little higher from where you were, okay? So he says, I will give you the stone tablets with the law and the commandments which I have written for the people's instruction. Verse 13, so Moses arose with Joshua, okay, his servant, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. Now notice verse 14. But the elders, he said, wait here for us until we return to you, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a legal matter, let him approach them. So Joshua is singled out. Notice Aaron is the high priest. But he's not allowed to come up higher with Moses. But Joshua is. Now, what does Joshua learn? What does he learn? This is part of his instruction.
From this story?
Yes, what's he learn? I think he learns a really big thing here.
Well, the God works directly with Moses, and later he will work directly with him.
True. And even further, Joshua knows the Lord.
Well,
He sees him.
He is in the cloud of
Right.
also. In
They all see the Lord. They all see the throne room. They all see the Lord. How important is this going to be when he goes back down and years later he leads the army of Israel into doing all these crazy things that God tells them to do? How important is it going to be for him to know, I know the Lord? Because again, when we get into the book of Joshua here in the first chapter, God says to him, do what I say and obey my words and you will have victory. He says it 3 times in that chapter. And again, it's important. It's important you got to know the Lord. You got to know who he is. You have to know who you're serving. Now, let's turn to, from Exodus 24, keep going to Exodus 33. And we're going to look at verses 7 through 11. Here's the next element of Joshua's training. Okay, starting verse 7, chapter 33, Exodus. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, a good distance from the camp, and he called it the tent of the meeting. Now, this is not the tent of the meeting of them all meeting together. This is not the tabernacle. The tabernacle hasn't been issued yet. This is a tent he sets up for what meeting? Who does he meet with?
God.
With God.
Mm-hmm.
That's the tent of meeting, okay, that he's talking about here. And he calls it the tent of meeting. It came about that everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And it came about, whenever Moses went out to the tent, that all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of their own tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. Now, part of the reason why they do this, you're going to see in the next verse, is because when Moses would meet with the Lord, the Shekinah glory would come down on that tent. And it was obviously a very unbelievable sight to see. So they'd all go look at it. As God came down, quote unquote, to the tent to meet with Moses. And it came about whenever Moses entered the tent, verse 9, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent, and the Lord would speak with Moses. Verse 10. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would arise and worship, each at the entrance of his own tent. Because they would see the glory of God right there in that tent. They could see it with their eyes. Verse 11. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. This is the unique thing that Moses experienced. Yeah, Jack?
Question, I'm a little confused. When he's talking about speaking with God, is he actually speaking with Christ, who is God, not Father God? There's a difference here.
I don't know.
I thought Father God is that.
Probably.
I thought Father God could never be seen by the human and live.
Well, Moses seems to be the exception. He seems to be the only exception, actually, to
Because
it.
it really shone when he came off the mountain.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He seems to be the one. Yeah.
I just wonder if this is Christ incarnate and all they're referring to God.
Yeah.
As Christ is.
Well, the point is, whoever is represented in the Shekinah glory, this in whatever element or manifestation or person of God, this is who shows up.
So it could be Christ, actually.
Could be. Okay, could be.
Isn't Christ usually when it say the Lord is referring to Christ?
Well, it can be, or it can be the Father also. You know, it can be either one.
I thought Father meant God. God the Father. God the Father.
Well, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit.
All God.
Okay, let's finish the verse here, 11, okay? When Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, the young man, would not depart from the tent. So what is Joshua learning?
Being a priest.
No.
He just wants to be with God.
That's it. He has a heart for God. He wants to be around God. If Moses is around God, Joshua wants to be around God. Okay? He has a heart for the presence of God. Think about what he's experienced up to this point. And as he goes to the tent meeting and meets with the Lord, the Shekinah glory comes down.
Well, wouldn't we all react if you were talking directly with God? I mean, how many people have power?
Well, but think about it. All the people saw the Shekinah glory. All the people saw this happen all the time. But what did the people do in a very short period of time?
They stayed at their tent.
And they made, and they started to gather their gold together and made a molten calf in image of the gods of Egypt, and they worshipped it and had a sexual orgy. So apparently it didn't impress them a whole lot. Okay? But the point is, it did impress Joshua.
I'd be impressed.
I hope we would all be impressed.
Yeah.
So there's another thing that we see in the preparation of Joshua. Now let's turn to Numbers chapter 13 from Exodus, and we'll look at this pretty well-known passage about Joshua, starting verse 21, Numbers 13. This, of course, is a story of God sending 12 spies out to go into the land and to reconnoiter. Okay? They're literally supposed to go through and figure out what the cities look like, what the people look like, What's the land look like? What's the topography look like? What's it all look like? So the 12, so we'll start in verse, in 22. When they had gone up into the Negev, that is the south, they came to Hebron, where they saw Ammon and Sheshai and Palmeh, our favorites here, the descendants of the Anak. In other words, the giants. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. He gives us a historical context here. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, and they carried it on a pole between two men with some of the pomegranates and figs. Big stuff. And when they returned from spying out the land, at the end of 40 days, they proceeded to come to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the sons of Israel in the wilderness of Paran and at Kadesh, and they brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Thus they told him, Moses, and said, we went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. In other words, Satan's got the giants spread out in regional areas all over this place. And Amalek is living in the land of the Negev. We know about him. And the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea, that is the western side, and by the side of the Jordan also. Then Caleb quieted the people, verse 30, and said, we should by all means go up and take possession of it, for we shall surely overcome it. So Caleb says, it doesn't matter how big they are. It doesn't matter what their cities look like. God has promised us the land. Do it. We need to do it. But the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against these people, for they are too strong for us. So they gave out to the sons of Israel a bad report of the land which they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have come in spying it out is a land that devours its inhabitants. If you saw a 19-foot giant, okay, you would say, I'm going to be devoured, okay? All right? And all the people whom we saw in it were men of great size. There also were the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. That is not a figurative speech. He's saying, when we looked at these guys, we were small and they were really big. Okay? So, we see Joshua and Caleb there, and we see this event which occurs. Joshua and Caleb, of course, are believing the promise of the Lord, and they're saying, let's do it. Now, let's go on a little bit. I'm going to read starting verse 4, chapter 14. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron and the whole congregation and said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in the wilderness. And why is it that the Lord brings us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return now to Egypt? Yada, 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 yada. Verse 6, and Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, of those who had spied out the land, tore their clothing. And they spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, the land which we pass through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they shall be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them. Here's the key. See? He has spiritual vision and spiritual eyes to see what God intends to do. And the Lord is with us. Don't fear them. Verse 10, and all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of the meeting to all the sons of Israel. So, Joshua and Caleb speak out. They almost get killed in the process. Okay? And what do they learn? Well, how does this prepare Joshua for the future? Trust the Lord.
There's going to be a lot of weeping around you.
Okay?
There's
Yes.
a lot of rebellion.
And also, he learns a very valuable lesson that we should learn. The majority are rarely right. Keep that in mind. The majority are rarely right. Do not let someone pressure you into doing something that you do not have the conviction from the Lord to do. The majority are rarely right. If that guy says, I think I need to do this, but you don't have the conviction about that, he can do it. You don't have to do it. Right? Follow the conviction that the Holy Spirit gives you. I mean, think about how many problems in denominations and churches for hundreds and hundreds of years have been because the majority ends up not being right. I mean, how many church splits have we had in the last 500 years? You know, why? Because people are so accurate and understanding? Not because they're stupid. And they do immature things. So we always have to have spiritual eyes and spiritual vision, not looking at human beings. Okay? Now turn next, as we get to the bottom here, turn over to Numbers 27. Just a few chapters over. Numbers 27. To see more about the preparation of this guy. Starting verse 15. Then Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, May the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation, who will go out and come in before them, and he will lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep who have no shepherd. So the Lord said to Moses, Take Joshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. So we learned a very valuable thing about Joshua, don't we? He has the Holy Spirit.
That's what happened in that tent, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay? He has the Holy Spirit, and it does not depart from him the rest of his life. Verse 19, have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation and commission him in their sight. In other words, verify he will be your next leader. Okay? And you shall put some of your authority on him in order that all the congregation of the sons of Israel may obey him. So here he is. He learns this and he's commissioned publicly in the process of doing this. Now, turn now from Numbers 27, and I want you to turn first to Deuteronomy 31. So go to the next book at the very end, to Deuteronomy 31. And we're going to start in verse 23 of Deuteronomy 31. Here's another element of what he learns in his preparation. Starting at 23. Then he commissioned Joshua the son of Nun and said, Be strong and courageous, For you shall bring the sons of Israel into the land which I swore to them, and I will be with you. And it came about when Moses finished writing the words of the law in a book until they were complete. At this point, Moses finishes the Torah. All 5 books, except for the last chapter, which he couldn't have because he died, okay? But it's all written. It's all been written down. Verse 25, that Moses commanded the Levites who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and place it beside the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, that it may remain there as a witness against you. In other words, what does Joshua learn?
Book is important.
He sees the Torah. He sees it's been complete. He sees it's supposed to have one of the most important places it can have, inside the Ark of the Covenant. And he sees the importance that God makes of the written word. Because you're going to see in chapter 1, he takes over writing it himself, or maybe has a secretary, but he becomes the next author. The next author is Joshua, that God uses. Now, finally, let's look at the last element of his preparation. Go back to Numbers chapter 11. I think this is really fascinating. Numbers 11. Oh, that the leadership of the churches would learn this one. Unfortunately, they rarely have. So let's read in Numbers 11, starting in verse 24. You there? So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. Also he gathered 70 men of the elders of the people and stationed them around the tent, this meeting tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him, and he took of the Spirit whom was upon him and placed him upon, that is the Holy Spirit, upon the 70 elders. And it came about that when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied. But they did not do it again. In other words, as the Holy Spirit entered them, they prophesied. The Spirit gave them something unique to say. They prophesied. Okay? Verse 26. But 2 men had remained in the camp. In other words, had not come out to the tent of meeting there. Okay? The name of the first was Eldad, and the name of the second was Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them. Now, they were among those who had been registered but had not gone out to the tent. And they prophesied in the camp. You get the picture? 70 go out to the tent. The Holy Spirit comes down. They prophesy. The 2 guys didn't go out. They stayed in the camp where the people are. The Holy Spirit came down on them, and they started to prophesy too. Okay? Verse 20. We don't know. They just didn't.
They were stubborn.
Verse 28. Then Joshua, the son of Nun, the attendant of Moses from his youth, answered and said, Moses, my Lord, restrain them. Who's he telling to restrain? The 2 guys. Tell them not to prophesy. Don't let them do that. Look at verse 29. But Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. Think about what he just told Joshua. Paraphrase it.
He wants everybody to be a prophet.
Yes, but even more than that. He's teaching Joshua about spiritual leadership.
Yeah.
Filled with the Spirit like it did on the day of Pentecost.
Okay? But even more.
Well, tell us.
Not to be jealous,
Okay?
not to be,
Why is Joshua upset? Why is he upset?
with
They weren't in the right place. Basically, Joshua felt that Moses didn't authorize these two to prophesy. That's why Moses said, "Are you jealous for my sake?" Okay? So he wants to tell them, be quiet, because Moses didn't authorize you to prophesy. Moses responds to him and says, "I wish everyone would be a prophet." Okay? So, in other words, Moses, in essence, says to him, the Lord will do what he wants done, and who are we to question him? The Lord will do what he wants done. Who are we to question him? Okay? It's not about how people obey the leader. It's about what God has planned, which may violate my concept of how and when and by what means he will accomplish his will. Think about the amount of time that is spent in the average church, the leader of the church dictating to everyone what they're supposed to do. And if someone would dare disobey them, what happens? Who gets removed from commissions? Who gets taken off committees? Who gets not voted for in the elder board? Who gets, the politics starts. The leader says, well, they're not my man. They're not doing what I want. So he finds a way to talk to the people, to get rid of this guy because he's not falling into the program. Because the program is all about the leader and not about the Lord. That's why.
That guy gets a group around him.
Of course. Of course.
Yeah.
Okay? In other words, the thing we hear about Moses is, it says Moses was the most humble man around. Moses knew the Lord, and Moses didn't really care about what people thought about him. His focus was, what's God want me to do? And so his point is, why are you worried about me? Okay? Why aren't you worried about what God's doing? Who cares if I didn't tell these guys they could prophesy? God wants them to prophesy. So do what God wants them to do. If only the church world would understand this. If only leadership would understand this. If only people would quit their power trips and trying to set things up by their own rules and develop their own empires. Moses didn't have an empire. He just did what God wanted him to do. Important lesson that Joshua learns here. Really important lesson. Yes?
I'm kind of wondering why he would try to keep those two guys from prophesying, because unless he thought they were faking it or something, because all the other ones were prophesying. Because in order for them to prophesy, then God would have had to give them the Holy Spirit. And so why would he think that God made a mistake, or why would he, you see what I'm going, kind of, especially after all we've learned about it.
Because Joshua, at that point, believed that everyone had an obligation to do what Moses said to do. Okay? It should be Moses.
was young at this point.
Yes.
wasn't he?
Well, at this point in Numbers, he's...
So he was like a mentor to the point where Joshua kind of, it seems like he kind of thought he had more power than God, or he just didn't
No.
think that deep and stuff.
No, I think the problem was that he so much respected Moses that he became confused about the authority of Moses versus the authority of God. That's his problem.
He didn't think that far. He was just,
Yeah, I mean, he admired Moses so much that he was upset that these two guys were prophesying in the camp and not with the 70. Okay? Now think about it. Can you not see the application in churches?
Oh, yeah.
You know? Well, that's not the way the leader does it around here.
Well, that's not the way our forefathers have done it.
Exactly. It's not the way our apostles of our group have done it. It's not the way our evangelists have done it. It's not the way our...
It's not how my mom and dad told me.
Another example of criticism of Joshua.
In a sense, it's not God's criticism of him. Actually, it's Moses' criticism of him. Moses is the one that kind of sets him straight. But the point is, he learns an extremely important lesson. It's the lesson of humility of leadership. That's the lesson he's learning here. And it's critical that he learned it so that he could lead these people in doing all that God wanted them to do and to accomplish when they come into the land. So, yes. Do you have a question?
No.
All right.
No.
Yes.
I have a question. Kind of came to me, so it might be stupid once I get it out. Could it be like, I mean, it's not that it just turned out that way, but that maybe even God planned it that way, so to teach Joshua that lesson?
He absolutely planned it that way.
So,
He absolutely planned it that way. One of the most, let me give you another example. How many people do you know, as parents, leaders of their family, in dealing with their children, basically as Christian people, take the position, you're supposed to obey me in all things, I'm your father or I'm your mother? Ever see that at all?
children, you mean have to obey their parents?
Now, here's my point. Is there a legitimate part to that? Yes, there is a legitimate part. But at what age? What age? I mean, I can't tell you the number of people that are 14 or 15 or 16 that their parents still act like they're 5 years old. Tell them everything to do or don't do. It's like, are you kidding me? Do you want them to learn? Do you want them to learn to make choices? Are you willing to accept that they're going to make mistakes? Wouldn't it be better if they made them when they were 15 and 25? Or you just want them to follow rigid rules all the time, and then they go out and do what everyone predictably does if they grow up under rigid rules. Most of them end up go out and blow their brains out in rebellion after they get out of home.
Extreme, no rules at all.
Or maybe. Or they end up being individuals that are so used to rules and being told what to do, how do they have any independence? How do they launch their own direction? How do they take risks? How do they go out and do things in the world around? Well, tell me what to do. Well, as an adult, really?
Okay.
Is that the way you're supposed to be?
The job is to prepare them to be
Independent people. But you can't prepare them to be independent if you control them all the time.
Right.
So there must be a transition as they're growing. But I'm telling you, I rarely see it. Sometimes I do, but I rarely see it. In very, very conservative churches.
Like with Lindsay, she's 19, but she's delayed sometimes with her maturity and responsibility and stuff. So since she's graduated and started college and got a job and stuff, I find myself saying, well, this is what I think you should do, or this is what God should do, or this is what I would do, or whatever, and say, but it's up to you. But it's up to you. And then I'm like,
I know.
I know. And then she'll come upset because she did the opposite of what I said, and I just kind of go,
time to learn.
yeah.
Okay. Yes. All right. So next, Michael, is Jericho in the land? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. What you'll find, and I'm going to put a map up